Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time then to see what is making the headlines with the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the Chief Executive of ConservativeHome, Mark Wallace, both of them with us until just before midnight. Welcome to both of you. So to the front pages then, let us start with The Guardian. It quotes President Joe Biden insisting that the leaked decision from the US Supreme Court, which looks set to overturn women's nationwide access to abortions, imperils civil rights. BP's first quarter earnings of $6 billion are prompting fresh calls for a windfall tax to be imposed on the oil giant with the aim of helping the public pay their energy bills. That is according to the Financial Times. The Mirror questions whether the PM will step in on the rising cost of living, saying the situation was beyond pathetic. The Metro reports that a man has appeared in court charged with funneling government loans intended to help his business during the pandemic to a group of Islamic State fighters in Syria. The Telegraph hears that senior MPs are demanding that the French government reveals what it knows about the use of Exocet missiles, which killed dozens of British sailors during the Falklands War. The man who can't answer a straight question. The Daily Mail takes aim at Keir Starmer over Beergate. Quick reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. So let's bring in our guests then, Sonia Sodha and Mark Wallace. We call it a mixed bag, don't we, when everything's got a different headline? But let's start with The Guardian, shall we, Sonia? And this leaked report, I mean, unprecedented to have a leak from the US Supreme Court of this opinion decision, effectively. But it's caused quite a stir because of the implications on abortion and other rights, in fact.
Yes, that's right. So the way it works in the Supreme Court is that there are drafts of judgments that will go round before the Supreme Court publishes its final judgment and makes it public. And what's been leaked to the press in the US is one of those drafts, which very much makes it look like the Supreme Court may be about to, in the coming months, overturn Roe V Wade. And for viewers who aren't aware of what Roe V Wade is, it's a really landmark piece of legislation, it's a landmark court ruling from the United States in the 1970s that essentially made abortion legal throughout the US. And it kind of acts as a guarantee of women's reproductive rights across the states. There are a small number of states that want to make abortion illegal or to make it incredibly restrictive. And Roe v. Wade has acted as a safety net to stop state governments doing that. Now, I think this is incredibly worrying because we know what happens when abortion gets severely restricted to women. It doesn't lower the abortion rate. What happens is that women try and do it themselves, and many women will end up losing their lives or doing themselves great harm. So whether or not you believe in the philosophical case for choice when it comes to women's reproductive rights, and I very much do, because a woman's body is her own and she should not be forced to go through with a pregnancy that she doesn't want. There is also a pragmatic case, which is that it doesn't stop abortion to make it illegal. It just means that you get very dangerous backstreet abortions. So this is incredibly worrying for women's rights in the US. I think it shows the extent to which, we've got a very settled consensus here in the UK now, really, which is that abortion must be legal, women must be able to access it, whereas in the US, where things are much more polarised, there is a fundamentalist religious right which has sought to roll back these very important rights for women. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think it's important to say, this goes against the grain of public opinion as well. There is definitely a significant majority in the US in favour of abortion.
Yes, I think Senator Warren suggested it was 69% of women certainly didn't want to see it. But we saw protests, did we not, at the US Supreme Court today from both sides. And Mark, we always knew this, that one of the biggest impacts of the Trump presidency was what happened to the makeup of the US Supreme Court. And here we are seeing one of the first consequences.
Potentially, yes. Obviously, the Supreme Court themselves are arguing in this unusual, very, very rare kind of leak situation that drafts don't equate to final conclusions, etc. But, this is a bit of a cautionary tale, I think, for this country. We often have kind of broad, sweeping comments that wouldn't it be great and much simpler if we had a written constitution, a purely written constitution, that in a binding sense, in the United Kingdom, when sometimes our own parliamentary system is a bit messy, to put it mildly. But this is a cautionary tale. Sonia, a couple of minutes ago, almost said that Roe v Wade was a change in the law and corrected herself rightly to say that it was a court verdict. Peculiarly, I don't think it's just about polarization of politics or polarization of society in the United States, which has made this such an ongoing, difficult, painful issue in their politics. It's partially because this whole thing was settled in the 1970s through a Supreme Court verdict based on a constitutional amendment passed in the 1860s, rather than going down the upfront political way of politicians being big enough and brave enough and bold enough and clear enough to make a decision and to legislate. It's undoubtedly the case, as Sonia says, that the American public opinion is not in favour of rolling back these rights of restricting women's reproductive rights in the way that a verdict like this would make happen. But they've ended up with this ludicrous position, really, where you have a part of the Constitution that doesn't seem to have necessarily been written with this aspect of law entirely in mind. A Supreme Court a century later making decisions and then threatening to go back on them back and forth. There's no way to establish basic rights like this. It should be something done through legislation, through politicians being bold enough to change the law for the things that they believe to be right.
Yes, well, we'll certainly keep an eye on what happens with that, won't we? But let's move on to the prospect or not of a windfall tax. This is front page of the Financial Times, prompted by the highest quarterly earnings for BP in more than a decade. Thanks to, of course, soaring prices for oil and gas, partly because of what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, Sonia.
That's right. So they're sort of making record earnings, which I think does rather shore up Labour's arguments for a windfall tax on energy companies. Now, obviously, the raw price of energy is going up, the raw price of oil is going up, and that's partly because of the Ukraine war, although that was already happening before Russia launched its latest invasion of Ukraine. But I think it's important to remember that even as the raw costs of materials go up, we often see oil companies, energy companies actually make very high levels of profit. And what we need to be careful doesn't happen is that rising prices are not used as a bit of a screen for companies also kind of making record earnings and paying out those earnings to shareholders rather than reinvesting them in the energy system and bringing
fair, though, many shareholders are pension funds for those lucky enough to have pensions. And the Chief Executive, Bernard Looney, did say it's just 15 months since BP recorded its largest loss because of low oil prices. He talks about volatility and also marked the need to invest both in the North Sea, as this idea of transition fuels, but also in things like charging points at all their service stations for electric vehicles. So where do you sit in this argument?
Well, indeed, it's important to bear those things in mind. Sonia's right, of course, to say that you must always be watchful against undue and unfair price gouging. And there's a story on the front page of the Telegraph, I think, with the business secretary warning against any suggestion of, there's allegations of manipulation of direct debit calculations and so on. You should always be careful to guard against things like that. But let's also look at what it is we've all spent the last 2 months saying we want of the energy system. We want these companies to divest themselves of operations in Russia. I think I'm right in saying that BP has said that it's going to do that, effectively abandoning a massive investment and oil and gas field that it has in Russia for obvious reasons, that Russia's now a pariah tyranny. We're also saying we want to rebuild the energy system so it's not so reliant on imports from Russia, but also from other tyrannies like Saudi Arabia, for example. At the same time, everybody's saying they want these big investments to pursue, for example, net zero, the electrification of cars, and so on and so forth. If you want to do all those things and have those pension funds and so on that you mentioned actually able to reap the money they need for people's retirement, what you cannot start doing is just standing up one day and saying, I'm the government, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to batter companies with arbitrary one-off windfall taxes. Things like that don't just have an immediate cash impact, they have a long-term investment impact, and they really affect the stability of the reputation for stability of an economy, for somewhere to invest in things like infrastructure, and that's really what we need on the energy front.
OK, both of you, there were plenty more things to talk about, but I'm afraid we've run out of time for that section because there's loads more to pack in, including we continue to take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview, including this on the front of the Times, their headline, "Privately Educated to Lose Places at Oxbridge." That in just a moment. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, the Observer's chief leader writer, Sonia Sodha, and the Chief Executive of ConservativeHome, Mark Wallace. Welcome back to both of you. And Mark, we're going to go to the Telegraph now, which is a story that dates back decades. Could you just explain to us what this is all about?
Well, in brief, it's a fascinating story. This is part of the 40th anniversary coverage of the Falklands War, and a lot of people who were watching and reading about that story at the time will remember the role played by Exocet missiles. These are missiles that the Argentinians had bought from France. They were cutting-edge technology. They hit 3 Royal Navy ships and caused the deaths of several dozen British service personnel. And what's really interesting is there's this allegation, there's a rumour at the time, now more suggestions and demands for it to be clarified by France, that there was a kill switch inside these missiles, that France had made them so that if they fell into the wrong hands and were fired at French ships, that there was a kind of signal you could send that would switch them off, would make them fall harmlessly into the sea, and that France refused or failed to disclose those to Britain, its ally, at the time of the war. And there's understandably MPs are now asking yet again for the Elysee Palace to come clean as to what was or was not known, and what was or was not done.
OK, and front page of the Times now, Sonia. The privately educated must accept they will not gain as many places at Oxford and Cambridge. In fact, other leading universities too. This is according to the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge.
Yes, so it's a very interesting intervention from Professor Stephen Toop, who is the Vice-Chancellor there. And what he's saying is that over time, the private school advantage in Oxbridge will erode. I think that's quite right too. So private school students are really quite overrepresented at Oxbridge. Oxbridge is a university where there are actually more teaching resources put in. And I think it's really important, actually, that these universities are open to everyone, all bright kids from all backgrounds. And the thing is that we know is that, that very bright kids from poor backgrounds, they tend to fall behind academically at school, not because they're not bright, but because they have less educational opportunities and advantages than kids from more advantaged backgrounds. And to me, that means that, a kid from a very working class background who gets perhaps an A and 2 Bs, that's sometimes a bigger achievement than someone who went to a private school and who, had very intensive tuition and support in the build-up to exam and got all A's. So I think it's actually really, really important that universities take a more flexible approach on this.
Sonia Sodha, Mark Wallace, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you.